I wonder how many of us have made New Year's resolutions. How many of us have broken them already? I don't know about you, but I like to start the new year off fresh. I like the kitchen floor scrubbed clean, though it seems constantly sticky while there's still crumbs being dropped in late night forages for Christmas cake. The Christmas presents tidied away. Much easier in my house now that Lego's no longer top of the Christmas present list. And I like the thank you letters written. As I've been doing these things, my thoughts turn to Mary at that first Christmas. How could she manage to keep her living area clean for her new baby when she's surrounded by animals? Did Joseph do his bit in shoveling manure? And how on earth do you begin saying thank you for gifts more costly than anything you've ever imagined, brought by a group of strangers? Who are these strangers? These travellers who have followed a star to find a new king? Well, Matthew doesn't tell us very much, but the wise men have always had great appeal in the story of Jesus' birth. They have been elaborated in art and poetry. They've been kings, priests and mystics, portrayed as very young, very old, somewhere in between, as members of a range of cultures and ethnic groups. They've been given names. This isn't just creative imagination. It reminds us that they represent all of us, all the people that Christ came to earth to save, in all our diversity and differences. And like all of us in how we think about God, these wise men probably searched for the new king with all sorts of assumptions. They had certain expectations, not least that the new king would be born into royalty, hence their visit to King Herod's palace. They went off track a bit, searching in the wrong place. The revelation of God was, still is, far from predictable. Today's Isaiah passage, in the context of Epiphany, illustrates the coming of God into the world as a brilliant light. We see the symbolism of that too in the shining star followed by the wise men. The light, the gift of God, carries with it the power to transform the world, restoring Israel, but also drawing in those outside of Israel. Part of the mysterious joy of Epiphany is the inclusion of everyone amongst God's people. In Isaiah, God's glory shines, and his people live in that glow, and they too become part of that light in the world. So God's people move from darkness into the light as the absence they've experienced from God becomes a felt presence. Their feelings of loss become wholeness. Their despair becomes hope. Isaiah tells us your sons and daughters will come, cared for, protected, valued, all those in exile. God is calling them all to the light. Isaiah sees a world in which the abused and forgotten are drawn in amongst those who more readily see themselves as God's people. And they bring new things with them, maybe material wealth, but more importantly, other gifts, experiences to learn from, new possibilities, new ways of being God's people, new ways of knowing and worshipping God. This is a time of glorious change, of a new submission to God's new future. When God is worshipped, everyone prospers, walls are broken down. God's presence creates newness for the whole world. Everyone can bask in God's glory and receive this gift of light and life. Contrast this picture of the light of the new king shining with joy and salvation for all with Matthew's depiction of Herod, the king who ruthlessly self-serving, who's misusing power to protect his own interests above all else, who casts a shadow over all and attempts to extinguish the light. So what can we take from this story? First of all, does Jesus' light still shine in the darkness, even today? Yes. Do the powerful Herods of this world continue to seek to extinguish the light? Yes. How can we respond to this? Well, by thanking God, by worshipping him for his gift to us in his Son, and also through lamenting, asking forgiveness for those who we might have excluded from being welcomed into God's light. For those individuals, maybe even including ourselves perhaps, who we haven't celebrated and affirmed, where we have acted more like a Herod in wielding our power in deciding who's in and who's out, than like wise men who understand that God's light is offered freely for everyone. So perhaps this year's New Year's resolution should be to know deeply for ourselves that through Christ we are all called, loved and wanted, and to shine God's light on others so that they can learn this good news too. Amen.